The desert wind howled across the valley like a ghost searching for its name. Among the cracked stones and forgotten bones, a line of rusted helmets lay half buried in the dust, remnants of men who were never meant to be remembered. No flags marked their graves, no songs told their story. Only silence remained, a silence so heavy it could crush the truth beneath it. They called them the Silent Regiment, a battalion erased not by the enemy's bullets, but by their own nation's fear. They were formed in the last desperate months of the 1943 winter campaign, when the world was bleeding from every border, and the Allied forces were running out of men to throw into the fire. The 91st Reconnaissance Regiment, codenamed Eclipse, was created in secrecy, its existence known only to a handful of military officials. Recruits were drawn from the ruins of lost units, soldiers with no families left, prisoners offered redemption, and men too broken to be sent home. Their orders were simple and brutal: to move behind enemy lines, sabotage communications, and vanish without trace. They weren't meant to win glory. They were meant to disappear. Before you continue this story, make sure to like and subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a heartbeat of those who never returned home, but never stopped fighting. At first, they did their duty with the silent discipline of ghosts. In the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, they moved like shadows, cutting through German supply lines and rescuing prisoners the world never knew about. Yet, with each mission, they lost another piece of themselves. The radio logs grew shorter, transmissions more distorted. By March 1944, the 91st had become a rumor even among their own army, a name whispered in mess halls and trenches, followed by uneasy glances. No one knew where they were, or if they were still alive. Captain Elias Ward, a man haunted by too many unfinished orders, commanded the regiment. Before the war, he'd been a schoolteacher from Connecticut, gentle, thoughtful, and far from the man the battlefield demanded. War had turned him into something else, a strategist who no longer believed in rescue or return. To his men, he was both savior and ghost. He never raised his voice, never smiled, but his presence alone kept the unit stitched together in the chaos. They trusted him because they had no one else left to trust. In February, Ward received a sealed envelope marked Directive 47. Inside were coordinates, deep within occupied territory, and one chilling order: recover the package. No witnesses, no explanation, no support. Just coordinates and silence. Ward didn't question it. None of them did. Orders were all they had left that made sense. So under the dim light of a moon that looked as tired as they were, the Silent Regiment began what would become their final mission. They crossed into enemy territory in 3 days. The snow was melting into thick mud, and every step sank them deeper into the earth, as if the land itself wanted to claim them. They traveled at night, slept in barns, and avoided villages. Private Keegan, the youngest of the unit, barely 20, used to write letters to his mother, even though he knew they'd never be sent. He carried them in his breast pocket, close to his heart, sealed with mud and blood. Beside him walked Sergeant Nolan, a man whose silence was so absolute that some whispered he had forgotten how to speak. By the 5th night, their supplies had run out. Hunger hollowed their faces, and frostbite had begun to claim fingers and ears. Yet Ward pressed on, guided by nothing but faith in orders and the ghostly glow of his compass. When they finally reached the coordinates, they found no German camp, no convoy, no package, only an abandoned village reduced to ashes. The smell of burnt timber and bodies clung to the air. It wasn't a mission zone. It was a graveyard. Inside the ruins of what had once been a church, they found a cellar door, bolted from the outside. Ward ordered it opened. Beneath the creaking wood, they discovered a dozen civilians, children, women, and a priest, all terrified, all hiding. They weren't German soldiers. They were survivors. That was when Ward realized the package wasn't an object. It was them. And the line, "no witnesses," wasn't a precaution. It was a command for extermination. The men froze. None spoke. But every pair of eyes turned to Ward. He stared at the civilians, shaking, crying, clutching each other in the dark. And for the first time since the regiment was formed, doubt cracked through his voice. "We're not doing this," he said quietly. "We came to end a war, not start another one." But radio silence from command was absolute. There were no clarifications, no updates, only the echo of that single impossible order. Some of the men obeyed, Some refused, and some, like Sergeant Nolan, simply turned their rifles toward the ground, unwilling to choose a side in hell. That night, the 91st Regiment, and once united in duty, splintered into factions under the same moon. Blood was spilled, but not by the enemy. By dawn, the snow was stained in two shades, crimson for the innocent and black for the damned. When reinforcements arrived weeks later, they found no trace of the 91st. Only burned logs, scattered boots, and an abandoned flag, its insignia scratched out. The official report said the unit was lost behind enemy lines, classified, buried, forgotten. But decades later, when an old farmer digging his field uncovered a rusted dog tag with the name E, Ward still legible beneath the dirt, a truth long buried began to stir again. And with it, the silence of the forgotten regiment began to whisper once more. The year was 1971. 27 years had passed since the 91st Reconnaissance Regiment vanished from every military record, every archive, every conversation. Time had turned their story into dust, scattered by bureaucracy and denial. But history has a strange way of resurfacing, usually when someone digs deep enough in the wrong place. That someone was Arthur Langley, a retired British war correspondent who had spent half his life chasing ghosts of forgotten battles. When the story of a rusted dog tag unearthed in a French valley reached his ears, it wasn't curiosity that drove him. It was obsession. The tag bore the name Captain Elias Ward, a man whose existence, according to official archives, had been erased entirely. Langley had seen that happen before. He knew what governments could bury under the weight of victory. He arrived in the small French commune of Saint-Mouron, a quiet farming village where the fields still whispered of old wars. The farmer, an old man named Henri Dufour, led him to the discovery site, a sunken patch of soil near what had once been a chapel. "I was just ploughing," Henri said, his voice trembling as he handed over the dog tag, still wrapped in the mud it had slept in for decades. Then the earth. It gave something back. Langley turned the tag over in his hand, E. Ward, 91st Recon Rect. The letters were faint but unmistakable. He could almost hear the metallic echo of the soldier's heartbeat trapped inside. He photographed the site, took samples, and began asking questions. Questions no one in the village wanted to answer. The locals avoided the old chapel ruins. Some said the ground was cursed, that strange lights had been seen there at night. Others claimed they could still hear voices, whispers carried by the wind that sounded almost human. Langley dismissed it as superstition. But the more he listened, the more that superstition began to sound like warning. He spent nights at the small inn by the crossroads, reading through declassified Allied records, but the 91st Regiment was nowhere. It was as if they had never existed. The only trace was a redacted document mentioning Operation Eclipse, a mission so classified that even its date was blacked out. Langley leaned back, cigarette smoke curling through the lamplight. "Eclipse," he muttered. "The sun goes dark. The world forgets." The next morning he met Mayor Lucien Roche, the oldest surviving resident of Saint-Mouron. The mayor was a tall, frail man with eyes that seemed to see too much. When Langley mentioned the regiment, Roche went silent for a long moment, then poured 2 glasses of wine. "You're looking for ghosts," he said finally. "But ghosts don't like to be found," Langley pressed. Roche sighed. "During the war, soldiers came here. Americans, I think. They arrived one night, then by dawn, the village burned. My father was a boy then. He told me they wore no insignias, no flags, only black scarves." He stared into the glass. "After that night, no one dared to rebuild the church. Some things were not meant to be remembered." Langley's heartbeat quickened. The pieces began to align. A secret regiment, a mission gone wrong, and a village wiped off the map. But what happened inside that church? That evening he returned to the ruins alone. The chapel's stone walls were half consumed by ivy, the bell tower leaning like a weary sentinel. The cellar door, the one Ward had ordered opened nearly 30 years ago, was still there, its hinges fused by rust. He forced it open. The stench of decay and earth spilled out, and for a moment he felt the air change, colder, heavier. Inside he found remnants of a camp, a tattered blanket, a corroded rifle, and something else. A journal sealed in a tin box, its leather eaten by time. The first page was still legible. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. February 18th, 1944. Directive 47 has begun. I fear we are not soldiers anymore. We are executioners. E.W. Langley's hands trembled as he turned the page. The entries grew darker, filled with guilt and confusion. Ward wrote about receiving contradictory orders, of men questioning their mission, of civilians hidden in the church cellar. They say we must eliminate witnesses, one entry read. But I cannot shoot a child and call it duty. God forgive me. The final entry was dated March 2nd, 1944. Tonight I end this. If this record is found, let it be known that we were not lost. We were silenced. Langley knew this was no myth. The 91st had been real, and so was the cover-up. He took the journal back to his room, making copies by hand. But the next morning, when he went to meet the mayor again, Roche was gone. The locals said he'd left for Paris, but Langley saw the fear in their eyes. Someone had warned him. By evening, Langley noticed a black sedan parked near the inn, foreign plates, tinted windows. When he approached, it drove off without lights. That night his room was searched. Nothing was stolen, except the original journal. His notes, camera, and map were untouched. Only the proof had vanished. Realizing he was being watched, Langley sent the copies of the journal to an old contact at the Observer in London. 2 days later, he packed his bag to leave. But before he could, Henri, the farmer, found him again. The old man looked pale, his hands shaking. "You shouldn't have opened that cellar," he whispered. "You woke something." He handed Langley an old photograph, a black and white image of soldiers standing beside the chapel, faces blurred by time. Yet one face was shockingly clear. Captain Ward, and beside him, a woman dressed as a nurse. On the back, someone had written, "Saint-Mauron, February 1944, for those we could not save." Langley stared at the photo until the edges blurred. A nurse? There was no mention of any medical personnel in the records. Who was she? And why was she with Ward? Days later, back in London, Langley began tracing her identity. The search led him to the Red Cross archives, where he found a record of a field nurse named Clara Myers, listed as missing in 1944 near the Ardennes front. Her last known post, Saint-Mauron. Further investigation revealed something even stranger, a letter intercepted by military censors, addressed to Captain Ward, but never delivered. The handwriting matched the journal. The letter began, "Elias, if we don't make it out, promise me they'll know the truth. Promise me they'll remember us." Langley's obsession turned to fever. He dug deeper, contacting veterans, searching through censored files and chasing fragments of truth across Europe. Everywhere he looked, doors closed. Witnesses refused to speak. Some who agreed to meet him backed out suddenly. A few disappeared altogether. It became clear this wasn't just a forgotten mission. It was a secret guarded by those who still held power. In early 1972, he received an anonymous note slipped under his apartment door. "If you want to know what really happened, go to Ward's hometown, Milford, Connecticut." No signature, no trace. Only that message. Langley flew to America, following the trail to the small coastal town where Captain Elias Ward had once lived before the war. The house was gone, replaced by a parking lot, but the local librarian remembered the name. "Ward?" she said, adjusting her glasses. "His sister used to come here every year, left flowers by the memorial on the hill." Langley climbed that hill, finding a small neglected monument dedicated to local sons lost in war. Among the engraved names, one had been chiseled out. The mark was deep, deliberate. It had once read Elias Ward. Standing in the cold wind, Langley realized the truth. Someone hadn't just forgotten the Silent Regiment. They had erased them, name by name, memory by memory. He closed his notebook, staring out toward the gray Atlantic horizon. Somewhere beneath that silence, buried under the noise of history, a story was still waiting to be told. But as he turned to leave, a figure appeared at the base of the hill, an old woman in a black coat holding a small bouquet of lilies. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You're looking for Elias," she said softly. Langley froze. "You knew him?" The woman nodded. "He wasn't supposed to die," she whispered. "He was supposed to come back for me." Langley stepped closer. "Who are you?" The woman's hand trembled as she placed the flowers by the monument. "My name is Clara," she said. "Clara Myers." The wind at Milford Hill carried the scent of salt and rain. the same scent that had followed Clara Myers for over 3 decades. Her hair was silver now, her hands frail. But when she spoke of Captain Elias Ward, her voice didn't tremble. It softened, like someone remembering sunlight in a place that had long forgotten warmth. Arthur Langley stood beside her, his recorder running quietly in his pocket, afraid to interrupt the weight of her silence. "I was a nurse with the 47th Medical Battalion," she began, her gaze fixed on the waves below. "We were stationed near the Belgian border when I met him. Elias wasn't like the others. Most soldiers wanted to forget what they saw. He wanted to remember because he believed someone had to. He used to say that war was only truly lost when memory died." She smiled faintly, then turned to Langley. "They told me he was dead, but deep down I knew that was a lie. You don't erase the kind of man who disobeys orders. You hide him." Langley pressed his notebook open. "Tell me about Saint-Mauron. What really happened there?" Clara's expression darkened. Saint-Mauron was never supposed to exist, not on any map. It was a holding site. Refugees, partisans, and prisoners. The 91st Regiment was sent there to clear evidence of something the Allies didn't want found. She paused, her breath shuddering as though the memory itself carried frost. "I wasn't part of the regiment. I was there because of the children. They needed medical care. When Elias and his men arrived, I thought they were there to help us evacuate. But when I saw his face, I knew something was wrong. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Orders had already been given." Langley leaned forward. "Directive 47, he whispered. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I overheard it that night. They were told to eliminate all witnesses. All of us, but Elias—" Her voice cracked. "He refused. He tried to get us out before the other half of his men arrived. He thought he could save everyone. He didn't know what was coming." Clara looked away and the sound of distant thunder rolled over the horizon. There was another officer, Lieutenant Rourke, ambitious, loyal to command, and cruel. He saw Ward's hesitation as treason. When the orders came through the radio, Rourke took them literally. He opened fire on the villagers. Elias tried to stop him. They fought, soldiers against soldiers, brothers in arms turning their weapons on each other. The regiment died that night not because of the enemy, but because of obedience. Langley wrote furiously, his pen scratching across the page. "And you?" "I was wounded," she said quietly. "Elias carried me to the church cellar. He told me to stay there, to keep the children quiet. I heard everything. Gunfire, shouting, the crack of burning wood. Then silence. When I came out at dawn, the village was gone. Only Elias remained. He was bleeding but alive. He gave me the journal and told me to take it west. Said someone had to know the truth. I begged him to come with me, but he shook his head. Her eyes filled with tears. He said if he left, the others who died there would stay forgotten. He wanted to stay until command came. He thought he could make them listen. I never saw him again." Langley sat back, the enormity of her words sinking in. A regiment sacrificed, not by enemy hands, but by their own command. Our truth buried to protect reputations, alliances, perhaps even the entire moral facade of victory. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked softly. "I tried," she whispered. "After the war I sent letters. To Washington, to London, to anyone who would listen. The letters were intercepted. I was warned to stop asking questions. And when I didn't, they made me disappear. Not physically, bureaucratically. My name was taken off records. My service erased, just like his." Langley looked at her, the lines of time etched across her face. But her eyes were the same as the girl in the photograph, determined, unyielding. "Clara," he said, "what if it isn't over? What if they're still hiding this?" She met his gaze. "Then you finish what he started." That night, Langley stayed at a small motel outside Milford. The rain hammered against the windows, the storm wrapping the world in static. He replayed Clara's interview on his recorder again and again, her voice trembling through the crackle of old tape. The more he listened, the more a question gnawed at him. If Elias Ward had died at Saint-Mauron, where was his body? No official grave, no remains, only silence. Unable to sleep, he spread his notes across the table. The coordinates from Directive 47, the journal entries, Clara's testimony, everything pointed to one conclusion. The operation wasn't just a field mission. It was a purge. But purge of what or whom? In the middle of the night, his phone rang. An unfamiliar voice spoke. "Mr. Langley, stop digging!" He froze. Who is this? The voice was calm, measured. You think you've found the truth? You haven't. What happened at Saint-Mauron wasn't an accident. It was containment. Containment of what? Langley demanded. The line went dead. He stared at the receiver, his heart pounding. Containment. The word echoed like thunder in his skull. He grabbed his coat, drove through the storm and returned to Clara's cottage. But when he arrived, the front door was open. Inside, the lights flickered. Papers were scattered across the floor, her photographs, her letters, her memories ripped apart. The smell of smoke filled the air. Clara was gone. Langley called her name, his voice breaking. Then he saw it. The lilies from the memorial crushed on the ground, and beside them, something glimmered in the half-burned ashes, a small brass locket. He opened it. Inside was a photograph of Ward, smiling faintly, his arm around Clara. On the opposite side, a faded note in his handwriting, "For when the world forgets." Langley clutched the locket to his chest. Whoever had come for her was the same force that had buried the 91st. They were still out there, still watching, and now they knew he had the truth. Days later, Langley sat inside a cafe in Washington, D.C., his hands shaking as he passed a manila envelope to his contact at the Observer. "This is everything," he whispered. "The journal, the interviews, the photographs. Publish it before they stop us." The editor, a grizzled man named Victor Hale, looked skeptical. "You're accusing Allied Command of war crimes, Arthur." "That's not a story. That's a declaration." "Then declare it," Langley shot back, "because if we don't, they win again." Hale sighed, flipping through the papers. "Fine, but if this blows back—" Langley nodded. "It will. It already has." As he walked out into the cold afternoon, Langley felt the weight of something ancient pressing on his shoulders. Not fear, but purpose. For decades, the Silent Regiment had been a whisper buried in dust. Now that whisper was about to become a storm. But that night, as he returned to his hotel, he noticed a folded note slipped under his door again. His pulse quickened as he opened it. "If you want the whole truth, and go back to France. There's one survivor left." No signature, just an address. Verdun Military Hospital, Ward 17. Langley stared at it in disbelief. A survivor? After 30 years. He packed his recorder, his notebook, and the locket. The silence was breaking. And this time, he intended to make the whole world hear it. The Verdun Military Hospital sat on the outskirts of a quiet French town, its limestone walls weathered by time, and the ghosts it housed. Built after the First World War, it had become a resting place for soldiers who survived every war since. Men whose bodies had healed, but whose minds never escaped the battlefield. Arthur Langley arrived under a grey sky that seemed to hang lower with every mile he drove. The rain followed him like a curse. Inside, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and old secrets. The nurses moved silently, their eyes downcast, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something that preferred to stay asleep. Langley showed the receptionist the note he had received, Ward 17. The woman hesitated before responding. "That wing is closed," she said softly. "Only one patient remains there. He's not like the others." Langley's pulse quickened. "His name?" She looked around, lowered her voice, and whispered, "They call him the captain. He doesn't speak, he just writes." Ward 17 was a forgotten corridor, sealed off from the main building by a heavy metal door. The air inside was colder, as if the walls themselves remembered pain. At the far end, beneath a flickering bulb, sat a man in a wheelchair. His face was pale and thin, his hair white, his eyes hollow yet sharp. In his trembling hands, he held a small notebook, filled with lines of writing that seemed endless. Langley approached slowly. "Captain Elias Ward." The man didn't look up at first. He kept writing, his pencil scratching like a heartbeat against paper. Finally, his hand stopped. He raised his head, and for a long moment, their eyes met, a stare that felt like it reached through time. "They said you were dead," Langley whispered. Ward's lips curved faintly, not a smile, but something close. His voice, when it came, was quiet and brittle. "In some ways, I am." Langley took a seat beside him, recorder running. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I found your journal. I spoke to Clara. At the mention of her name, Ward's eyes flickered with something fragile. Sorrow, maybe love, maybe both. "Clara," he murmured. "Is she—" Langley hesitated. "She's gone." Ward closed his eyes. For a moment, the old soldier disappeared, replaced by a man who had once believed the world could be good. "Then I truly am the last," he said. Silence filled the room, heavy and sacred. Langley finally broke it. "Captain, what really happened at Saint-Mauron?" Ward's fingers tightened around the notebook. "You've read my words," he said, "but words can't carry the sound of what we did." He looked out the window, where rain traced rivers down the glass. "They told us we were cleaning up a communication post. They didn't tell us that post was a Red Cross safe zone, a refuge for civilians and defectors. We were told there were spies, that they'd been transmitting coordinates to the enemy. I believed them, we all did." He swallowed hard. "Until we saw the truth. Children, priests, wounded soldiers who had surrendered. It wasn't a military post. It was a sanctuary. We realized too late." Langley leaned forward. "Why didn't you disobey?" Ward's voice cracked. "Because by then the war had changed us. Orders were the only thing left that felt real. Disobedience meant chaos, and chaos meant death. I gave the command to secure the area. Rourke, he gave another. When I tried to stop him, he called me a traitor." He turned the notebook toward Langley. On the page, a single line was written over and over. "We became what we were fighting." "I tried to save who I could," Ward continued. "Clara, the children. But once the first shots were fired, the world went mad. My men turned on each other. Half wanted to flee, half wanted to finish the job. I killed Rourke myself. He was about to execute a child. After that, there was no turning back. When it was over, the village burned. The air smelled of smoke and blood. I radioed command, begged for extraction. You know what they said?" Langley shook his head. Ward's voice hardened. "They said, 'There is no 91st Regiment.' There never was." Langley felt the chill crawl down his spine. "So they erased you?" Ward nodded. "Every file, every record, every name. We weren't soldiers anymore, we were ghosts. The army buried our existence to protect their image. They called it containment, but what they really meant was silence." He paused, his gaze distant. "When command finally arrived, I surrendered myself. They said I would be debriefed. Instead, they brought me here, told the doctors I was insane, that I suffered from delusions. They gave me medicine that made the world soft and blurry. I started forgetting, faces, places, even my own voice. But the memories never truly die. They just whisper until you can't sleep anymore." Langley's throat tightened. "Why are you still here?" Ward gave a weary smile. "Because I stayed alive long enough to remember. And someone has to remember." He handed Langley the notebook. Inside were pages and pages of names, soldiers, villagers, children, written with obsessive precision. "These are the ones we lost," he said, "not in battle, but in silence." "Every name they erased," I wrote back. Langley stared at the list. Hundreds of names, the forgotten, the condemned. "This can change everything," he said quietly. "People need to know." Ward shook his head. "People don't want the truth. They want the story that makes them proud. If you publish this, they'll come for you, like they came for her." "I don't care," Langley said. "If I stop now, then they win again." Ward looked at him for a long time, the faintest glimmer of approval in his tired eyes. "Then take it," he said. "Take it and make them remember us." Langley nodded. "I will. I promise." Ward's hand trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a single dog tag, its metal dulled by age. "There's one more thing," he said. "The real Directive 47 wasn't just about Saint-Mauron, it was a test. They wanted to know how far soldiers would go if told to kill for the greater good. We were the experiment. The mission wasn't to destroy the enemy. It was to destroy conscience." Langley's heart pounded. "Who gave the order?" Ward's voice dropped to a whisper. "It wasn't from command. It came from higher, above the generals. A committee, Eclipse Division. They used us to prove that morality could be engineered out of men. And when it worked, They buried the evidence. He leaned closer. They're still out there, Langley. Different name, same purpose. You pull at this thread, you won't just uncover history. You'll uncover the machine that built it. The lights flickered. Ward coughed, his breath shallow. Langley rose, calling for a nurse, but Ward caught his hand. "Promise me," he gasped. "You'll tell them. We weren't monsters. We were men who forgot how to be human." Langley's eyes burned. "I promise." Ward smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softening. "Then maybe silence won't be our legacy." His grip loosened. The pencil fell from his hand. And just like that, Captain Elias Ward, the last soldier of the Silent Regiment, was gone. Langley stood there motionless, the sound of the rain outside merging with the distant echo of boots and gunfire only he could hear. He looked down at the notebook in his hands, a monument built of memory and guilt. He walked out of the Kai hospital into the storm, clutching Ward's notebook against his chest. The rain washed over him, but for the first time he didn't feel cold. He felt the weight of history and the fire of duty. In the distance, thunder rolled like artillery. The Silent Regiment was silent no more. The snow had started to fall again, softly at first, then heavier, until the world outside the ruined cathedral was nothing but white silence. Inside, the surviving members of the 9th lay scattered, some asleep, some staring into the flickering light of the dying fire, and some simply staring into nothing at all. Their faces were hollow, their eyes dull, their uniforms torn. They were ghosts now, men who had outlived their own memories. The once proud regiment that marched through cities with drums and banners had become a whisper in the wind. Only a handful of names remained, and even those were fading into the cold night. Colonel Reeve sat against a broken pillar, his arm bandaged, his breath shallow. He held the small mud-stained journal he'd kept since the first day of deployment. The ink had run on most pages, the paper worn thin. But he still turned through them carefully, as if each word carried a heartbeat from the men who were gone. His hand trembled as he stopped at a familiar page, the first entry, written in calm handwriting months ago. "We are not fighting for glory, but for each other." He exhaled slowly, whispering to himself, "And that was the only truth we ever had." The morning came grey and bitter. The sound of distant artillery had vanished days ago. Perhaps the war had moved elsewhere, or perhaps it had simply ended without them. The silence was heavy, not peaceful but suffocating. Reeve ordered a final roll call. Only 13 men answered. The rest were either buried outside under the snow or too wounded to speak. The regiment that once numbered over 300 had been reduced to a handful of breathing remnants. When the supply plane finally appeared in the horizon, it was like an illusion. The faint drone of its engines echoed across the valley. Men stumbled out into the snow, waving tattered flags and burning flares. The aircraft dipped low, dropping crates by parachute, food, blankets, and medicine. The men cheered weakly, though most lacked the strength to even stand. One of them, a young private named Halden, laughed through cracked lips and whispered, "We're not ghosts after all." But his words were lost in the wind as he collapsed. For 2 days they recovered what they could. Some regained strength, others didn't make it through the cold nights. And then, without warning, orders came through the radio: retreat. Evacuation scheduled at dawn. Abandon the post. Burn everything. There was no explanation. Reeve sat silently by the radio, listening to the repeating command. His jaw tightened. The regiment had held this line for 147 days. Hundreds had died here. To leave it behind now without honor felt like betrayal. That night he gathered the survivors. "We'll follow orders," he said, his voice hollow. "But before we go, we make sure no one forgets what happened here." He tore pages from his journal and handed them to each man. "Write what you remember. Names, places, faces, write the truth. If one of us makes it out, he'll carry them all." The men nodded quietly. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scratching of pencils and the slow breathing of men who had lost everything but duty. As dawn broke, smoke rose from the cathedral. They had set fire to their shelter as ordered. The flames licked the stained glass, casting red and gold across the snow. It was beautiful in a tragic way, like a funeral pyre for the forgotten. They marched down the mountain path in single file, boots crunching in the snow. Reeve carried a single satchel slung across his chest. Inside it, the combined pages of every man's account. Behind him, the last flag of the 9th fluttered weakly in the cold wind before disintegrating into ash. Halfway down the ridge, they found the valley crawling with fog. Visibility dropped to nothing. The column slowed. Then came the sound, faint footsteps, distant, approaching. The men froze. Shadows moved in the mist. For a moment, Reeve thought it was another patrol, maybe the enemy. But as the shapes drew closer, something felt wrong. The figures didn't move like soldiers. They didn't speak. They just walked, slow, heavy, deliberate. When the fog thinned for an instant, Reeve saw them clearly. Rows upon rows of faces, familiar faces. Men of the 9th, the dead, standing silently in the snow, their eyes empty, their uniforms ragged. The living froze in terror. Some dropped their rifles. Others whispered prayers. Reeve stood motionless, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The apparitions stood there, silent, unblinking, like memories refusing to fade. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, the fog swallowed them again. When it cleared, they were gone. But in the snow where the ghosts had stood were footprints, hundreds of them stretching into the distance, leading toward the valley below. Reeve's hands shook. He turned to his men. "Keep moving," he said quietly. "They're showing us the way home." They followed the ghostly trail through the valley until they reached the extraction point, a frozen riverbank where helicopters waited. As they boarded, Reeve turned back one last time. The mountain was covered in mist, but somewhere in that fog lay the graves of his brothers. He saluted the silence and whispered, "Rest now, boys. You've done enough." Years later, long after the war ended, the story of the 9th Regiment was buried beneath layers of politics and classified reports. The operation was never officially acknowledged. On paper, the 9th didn't exist. But deep in the archives of forgotten wars, an unnamed file surfaced decades later. A weathered journal bound by torn leather containing the words of men who refused to be forgotten. The first page was signed Colonel Elias Reeve, 9th Infantry. The Silent Regiment. The final entry read, "If anyone finds this, know that we fought not for victory or medals, but for the man standing next to us. History may forget our names, but the snow will remember our footprints." Some stories end in silence, first but the echo of their courage. Never fades. If you felt their sacrifice, then don't forget to honor them. With a like, a share, and your respect,